Imagine you suddenly lose your father and then your mother abandons you. Imagine you then spend your childhood in and out of foster homes and orphanages, working on farms for almost no money. That was the brutal reality for the founder of Domino's Pizza. And the story of how he turned his life around and built a billion-dollar empire is incredible. However, this is not a straightforward success story. Domino's has faced multiple scandals, including million-dollar lawsuits over their deadly drivers, a disgusting viral video that threatened their entire reputation, a literal hostage situation because of their bizarre mascot, and that time where Domino's basically admitted their pizzas were terrible. At times, the Domino's story is a tragedy, and yet at other times, it's an incredible tale of innovation and perseverance. It's filled with lessons, controversy, and multiple twists. Honestly, I don't think the full Domino's story has ever been told quite like this until now. So sit back and relax as we're going on a journey into the insane history of Domino's. Thomas Monahan was born on the 25th of March 1937 in Ann Arbor, Michigan. His father was a truck driver and his mother was trying to finish nursing school. Whilst the family weren't well off, they got by just fine, and it was a happy start to life for Tom and his little brother Jim. But it didn't last long. Tom's father soon developed an infection in his abdomen due to severe ulcers, and on Christmas Eve 1941, when Tom was just 4 years old, his father passed away. From that moment on, Tom's happy childhood descended into a nightmare. The first few weeks after his father's death were a blur, but Tom vividly remembered visiting the funeral home and seeing his father lying in the casket and screaming at his father to wake up. Meanwhile, without the income from Tom's father, Tom's mother abandoned her nursing plans and got a job at the Argus Camera Company, making $27.50 a week. Unfortunately, it quickly became clear she couldn't afford to raise 2 kids by herself, and thus she put Tom and his brother Jim into a foster home. Her plan was to go back to nursing school and get a higher paying job, then come back to look after the kids herself when she could afford to. But in reality, it would be 7 years before that happened, and the brothers would be in and out of various foster homes and orphanages in that time. The brothers understandably struggled with this, and it didn't help that Tom's first foster parents were very strict and argued constantly. Then, after 2 years, the foster parents decided they no longer wanted to look after Tom and Jim, so the brothers were sent off to a Catholic boarding school instead, St. Joseph's Home for Boys, which was both a school and an orphanage run by nuns. Tom later described his time there as intensely unhappy. Tom was fairly small and got picked on quite a bit, but he had a fierce temper and would fight back, often getting into scrapes with the other children. And even the teachers were brutal. You were whipped if you put a foot wrong. Whilst at that boarding school, Tom would often dream of a very different future for himself. He one day told the class that when he was older, he wanted to be a priest, an architect, and a shortstop for the Detroit Tigers. The kids laughed at him, telling him he couldn't do all that. But Tom had a lot of ambition. Despite how challenging life was, Tom regularly told people that one day he was going to be rich and famous. And the boarding school did instill Tom with a strong work ethic and a mindset that no matter how tough things get, you don't give up. By 1949, Tom's mother finally returned. She was now a qualified nurse, and so the boys went to live with her again, as she felt she could finally afford to raise her kids. She was wrong. Their financial woes were far from over, and Tom had to take on odd jobs himself to help support the family. He found a job selling newspapers, a job picking cherries in the summers, and when he had time, he would go sell fresh produce from door to door. In all of these jobs, he would often try to think of ways the process could be more efficient so he could make more money. And this was Tom's first brush with sales and entrepreneurship, which he really seemed to enjoy. But his life at home was not so great. Him and his mother were in constant arguments, and their relationship became more and more strained, until eventually Tom's mother put him and his brother back into foster care. They'd only been living with her for just over a year, but one day Tom's mother broke down and said she couldn't handle being both their mother and father. So once again, the two boys were in and out of different homes. Although at one point, Tom's brother went back to live with their mother, whilst Tom got shipped out to live on a farm, where he worked extremely long hours. But it was on that farm whilst working one day that Tom was struck with an epiphany. He later said, "Standing up to my ankles in muck, I saw that I had been wallowing in crass, worldly thoughts when I should have been concentrating on my spiritual quest. I decided then and there I would become a priest." His time with the nuns had clearly influenced him, and so he applied to St. Joseph's Seminary in Michigan and was thrilled when he got accepted in 1952. And Tom felt at home here. He thought he'd finally found his true calling in life. But less than a year later, he got kicked out. Tom later reflected that he was a little mischievous, breaking minor rules, talking when he shouldn't, being a little rowdy, but nothing serious. Tom believes the real reason he was kicked out was because of a letter from his mother where she asked why he never wrote home much. All the other kids wrote to their parents at least once a week, but since Tom obviously had a difficult relationship with his mum, he wrote to his aunt more instead. But the seminary had strict family values, and Tom was told to pack his bags. He broke down crying. His dream of becoming a priest was shattered, and he later said, "Never before or since have I felt so crushed." To make matters worse, Tom had no other option but to move back in with his manic-depressive mother. His mum wasn't happy either to find Tom back on her doorstep, and almost immediately they began their usual arguments. Now, to be fair, they were both as bad as each other. His mum was known for throwing temper tantrums and having mood swings, but Tom himself could be extremely argumentative and grow aggressive. It was a bad combination. They were also still low on cash. Tom's clothes had holes in, and so did his shoes, so he was constantly embarrassed at school. The one thing they did have though was an old car, which one day Tom borrowed without telling his mum where he was going. She got so worked up that she called the police on him. Tom was so angry she'd done that, he decided to spend the night in jail rather than go home and apologize to his mum. But he thought that was the end of it, just another one of their fights. But it wasn't. Several days later, when Tom was walking home, a car pulled over and a county sheriff told him his mother had signed papers putting him in a juvenile detention home until he was 18. So just to recap, since his dad had died, he'd been in foster homes, then the boarding school with the nuns, then when he came back home, his mum sent him off to the farm, and now he was being sent to a juvenile detention home. Tom was furious. In his eyes, his mum had ruined his chance of becoming a priest, and now, even though he'd not committed any crime, he was essentially being locked up and described as a delinquent. He couldn't understand why he was being treated like a criminal. Tom stayed in the detention home through his junior year of high school, and these were some of the darkest times of his life. But luckily, Tom finally got some good news. When his Aunt Peg found out where he was, she petitioned the courts to get custody of him. His aunt and uncle were kind to him, and for the first time in a long while, Tom's life felt more stable and normal. Tom continued to do odd jobs to earn money. He worked in a bowling alley, he was a busboy, and countless others. But between work and getting distracted by girls, Tom didn't do so well at school. He just didn't care about it that much. And at one point, it didn't even look like he'd graduate high school. It was only when he saw his aunt making preparations for his graduation that he realized he didn't want to let her down. So Tom pleaded with his teachers not to hold him back a year, and he did just enough to graduate last in his class. But he did graduate. His yearbook quote under his photo was, "The harder I try to be good, the worse I get. But I may do something sensational yet." Shortly after, Tom enrolled in Ferris State College, and this time he worked hard. He improved his grades and then got accepted at the University of Michigan. However, he couldn't afford to pay the tuition fees. But that's when he heard that his college would be paid for if he joined the army. So Tom spent the next few days getting physicals, taking tests, and signing forms, intending to join the army. Except just as he almost finished with the registration process, he noticed one of the forms said Marine Corps. Tom said, "Wait, is this the Marine Corps or the Army?" The guy looked back at him incredulously and said, "It's the Marines, you dummy." But at this point, Tom decided to go with it anyway and use his time in the Marines to work on both his physical and mental health, which, to be fair, he did. Whilst there, he also read a lot of self-improvement books, and in later life he reflected, "I knew if I could survive the Marines, I could handle anything." During his time in the Marines though, Tom would constantly daydream about his future empire. He would think about all the cars, homes, and planes that he was gonna buy. And so in 1959, when Tom received an honorable discharge from the Marines, he set out to begin building his dream. By this point, he'd saved about $2,000 to pay for his college tuition. Unfortunately, once again, Tom's life did not go to plan. Before he could enroll in college, Tom fell for a get-rich-quick scheme and lost every penny he had. It all began when Tom met a charismatic man who said his name was John Ryan and that he worked in the oil business. He enthralled Tom with stories of the big deals he'd made and told Tom of a new project he had his eyes on that he just needed investors for. Through an elaborate story, the scammer managed to convince Tom to invest his money for part ownership in an oil well, which the guy claimed was guaranteed to make a profit within just a few weeks. But of course, it never did. Tom's tuition fee money was gone, and Tom was left with just $15. On top of everything else, Tom started getting severe headaches and earaches, and at times the pain was so bad he couldn't concentrate on anything else. He would only later find out he had a ruptured and infected eardrum. But once again, despite the difficult circumstances, Tom worked hard and tried to save every cent he could and eventually managed to enroll in college. Except this time, he had to defer, because he had no money to pay for the books and was working so much he didn't have time for his classes. So he vowed he'd continue to save money even longer and try again next semester. As you can see, Tom's early life was really just a string of unfortunate events, and getting repeatedly kicked. Just when he thought he was making progress, something new would go wrong. Sure, some of it was self-inflicted, like his argumentative nature or the naivety to fall for the oil scammer, but there was no doubt Tom had been unlucky with his start. So, faced with this new setback, Tom began thinking of ways to earn more money, and he soon got a job at a newspaper distributor and started selling newspaper subscriptions. And he quickly managed to gain a lot of customers by offering to deliver the papers to their doorstep. This was Tom's first brush with the delivery business. Little did he know that in just a few years, he was going to revolutionize the industry by delivering pizzas to people's doorsteps. But this experience at the newspaper was crucial though, not just because he earned money, but because of the skills he learned. Once Tom proved his value, the owner began teaching him more about the business side of things, like bookkeeping and dealing with suppliers. At one point, the owner even had to explain to Tom what a memo was. But it was here that Tom learned the basics of running a business, and he found that he not only enjoyed it, but seemed to be good at it. And that's when, out of the blue, an even bigger business opportunity presented itself. One day, Tom's brother Jim came to him with an idea that would change everything. Tom's younger brother Jim was a full-time mailman, but in order to make extra money, he was also working at a restaurant owned by a man named Dominic DeVarty. Whilst working there, Jim overheard Dominic saying that he owned another restaurant in Michigan that had been shuttered for months, and he was trying to sell it. The restaurant was named after him, simply called Dominic's, and it was a small hole-in-the-wall pizzeria that also sold sandwiches. But Dominic said he hadn't had any success with it, and he wanted to sell it as soon as possible. He was asking for only $500 for the store, but that also came with over $2,000 worth of debt, which the buyer would have to take on. Still, it was a relatively cheap price, and when Jim overheard this, it filled him with excitement. He approached his brother Tom and asked him if he wanted to go in on the store together, since Jim didn't think he could do it by himself, but figured they could manage it between them. The store only opened 7 hours a day, from 5 PM until midnight, so they could split shifts between them so Jim could continue his other steady job as a mailman, and Tom would have enough time to study and fulfill his dream of going to college. It seemed a win-win, and sure enough, Tom was on board. Neither brother had much money, but they took the little savings they had and also took out a $900 loan from the post office credit union, which was enough to buy the store off DeVarty and cover their initial startup costs. Dominic DeVarty let the brothers keep using his name for the business, so it would still be called Dominic's. And DeVarty also shared with them his sauce recipe and quickly showed them how to actually make pizza, since neither Tom or Jim had done it before. The brothers then hired 2 laid-off factory workers to do deliveries who agreed to work solely on commission. The brothers then officially opened Dominic's for business on December 9th, 1960. Their total sales that first week amounted to just $99. And to be honest, it was surprising they even made that much, as they didn't even have a phone for the first week, so were relying on customers walking through the door. But once they got everything up and running, things did begin to pick up, and sales were at $750 a week by late April. And I'd like to tell you this is a heartwarming story of 2 brothers who had a rough start in life teaming up together and having amazing success. But I can't tell you that. Turns out most of their sales were to a nearby college, and so when the semester ended and the students left campus, sales fell to just $200 a week. Before long, Jim began working on the store much less, which inevitably led to several long arguments between the brothers, including one where they began throwing plates at each other. And within just 8 months of opening the store, Jim quit completely, despite the fact it was his idea originally. But Jim just felt the store demanded far more work and time than he'd anticipated. And since the business was not very profitable at this point, Jim didn't want to leave his steady full-time job to fully commit to the business. He wanted out. So Tom agreed to give Jim the Volkswagen Beetle they used for delivering the pizzas in exchange for his half of the business. Given that this business would go on to be worth billions of dollars, trading 50% ownership for an old car has got to be one of the worst business deals imaginable, especially since Jim would go on to be a security guard and then an electrician and would never have much financial success. But at the time, back in the early 60s, it seemed like Jim had got the better deal. Tom was left all on his own with a 100% ownership of a struggling business. And thus, Tom had no choice but to step up his involvement in Dominic's after Jim's departure. This meant once again his college dream was shattered, as he had to go all in on the business now he didn't have Jim to help. But like always, Tom got to work. He said, "In that instant, I made the decision to commit myself, heart and soul, to being a pizza man." Tom knew it was going to be tough though. At one point, he was so low on money, he ended up living in the store for a little while, sleeping there at night. He certainly couldn't afford a decent meal, and would only eat his own pizzas if they were burnt or a customer didn't pick it up and it was going to be thrown away. Tom was working 100-hour weeks. But slowly but surely he was making progress. He was eventually able to hire 2 more employees to help make pizzas while still netting $400 a week in profit. And when he wasn't working at the store, he was doing market research. He sampled nearly every pizza store in the nearby area, taking note of what each one did well and what it didn't. During his research, Tom was lucky enough to strike up a conversation with the owner of a local old Italian restaurant who had the best pizza sauce he'd ever tasted. And luckily, he volunteered to show Tom exactly how he made his sauce. Tom then implemented this for himself at Dominic's, and his pizzas immediately started tasting better, which meant sales increased further. With things picking up with this first Dominic's store, Tom began to think he could do the same thing in other college towns. In fact, someone even told him about Mount Pleasant, the home of Central Michigan University and its 5,000 students, which Tom became convinced would be a perfect spot to open a second pizzeria to expand his business. Of course, with his brother Jim having left the business, Tom would need someone else he could trust to run the original Dominic's store if he was going to open another store 100 miles away. And the good news was, he was about to meet his future partner. The bad news is this partner would destroy everything Tom had worked so hard for. A man named Jim Gilmore stopped by the store one day and Tom recognized him immediately. Gilmore had previously founded one of the city's best known pizzerias, and so the two men got chatting about the pizza business. Tom was immediately impressed by this older guy's knowledge and experience in the industry. Gilmore did eventually admit that he'd gone bankrupt twice because of a drinking problem, but he said he'd overcome that and now wanted to get back in the game. Tom took the bait and asked Gilmore if he wanted to team up, and Tom explained his idea of opening a second store but needing someone to run this first store. Little did Tom know, this is exactly what Gilmore had been hoping Tom was going to suggest when he came into the store that day. Gilmore said he'd accept Tom's proposal on the condition they would be equal partners in the business. Tom knew he needed help, so he agreed, and the deal was Gilmore would put in $500 for 50% ownership of the business. Although Gilmore said he didn't have the cash right now. Tom was so desperate for help though, he said Gilmore could pay him later, thus essentially trading half his company for no down payment. And he would never get that money. Now, this deal with Gilmore wasn't an outright scam like the oil man scheme that Tom fell for in the past, but this deal with Gilmore would later be described as the most one-sided partnership in history. You see, Gilmore had his attorney draw up an agreement for the partnership, but it put all present and future debts as Tom's responsibility. Gilmore also said he'd be keeping his day job as a dorm cook, but since Dominic's was only open in the evenings, he told Tom he'd have plenty of time to run the store, meaning Tom could open a second pizzeria in Mount Pleasant like he wanted. In theory, it all sounded good. In reality, it was a disaster. With Gilmore in charge of the first Dominic's store, it became much less profitable. Sales were down a third, and Gilmore began asking Tom to send more money to help cover bills. Tom was so busy with the second store that he only later realized what a terrible job Gilmore had done of running the first store. The pizza quality had dropped massively, and money had been wasted on things like adding a pinball machine. Tom even suspected Gilmore may have been taking money out of the till, although he couldn't prove that. Now, to be fair, Gilmore had given Tom a lot of advice, so it's not like he'd completely done nothing. But it just didn't seem like Gilmore had the drive to do much work himself. Tom was working non-stop, most of his waking hours 7 days a week. Meanwhile, Gilmore just seemed to work whenever he felt like it. In other words, Gilmore was taking advantage of Tom. Eventually though, Gilmore's health deteriorated further and the two men talked about splitting up the partnership. Gilmore once again proposed an offer that was ridiculously one-sided, where he would get way more money than he deserved. But thankfully this time, Tom had the sense to hire his own attorney, and eventually their lawyers reached an agreement, and Tom finally got out of this disastrous partnership with Gilmore. Of course, that certainly didn't mean Tom's problems were over. He was now back on his own, and actually left in debt because of this previous arrangement. At one point his lawyer advised him he might be better off filing for bankruptcy, but Tom vowed he'd instead work his way out of it. And indeed, Tom continued to work almost all hours of the day, often returning home about 4:30 AM. Having said that, Tom did find a lot of fulfillment in the work, and the job was finally about to lead him to some good news. One night in February 1962, Tom left a trainee behind the counter as he decided to go deliver a pizza order for himself. And it was on that delivery he met a girl named Margie. Now, even though Tom was often shy around girls and hadn't been on a date in at least a year because of how busy he'd been with the store, he was so drawn to Margie that he eventually struck up the courage to ask her out. Shortly after, it was Valentine's Day and he sent her a heart-shaped pizza. By their third date, he knew she was the one he wanted to marry. And a year later, They were. At this point, Tom was 25 years old, but Tom told Margie he would be a millionaire by the time he was 30. She laughed, but he was serious. He was not going to stop working until he hit his goals. Unfortunately, Tom's work did sometimes cause problems for them. One night, Tom had got so stressed out by work, he drank extremely heavily, and he could be a mean drunk. He ended up yelling at Margie. Then when she got scared, it only made Tom even angrier. So much so, he accidentally knocked over the Christmas tree. The following morning, he vowed he would never drink like that again. Tom always had a temper and lack of self-control, and drinking exacerbated it. Tom kept his word about the drinking, but he would soon find himself in another argument. This time with Dominic DeVarti, the man who had sold Tom and his brother their first pizza store originally. It was because of Dominic DeVarti that Tom's store was called Dominic's, and that was the problem. Dominic DeVarti called Tom and told him he had to stop using the name Dominic's, as DeVarti was still using the name himself for his other restaurant, and his customers were apparently getting confused, thinking Tom's store was part of the same chain. Now, whilst it's true they shared the same name, they were in different towns serving different customers, so Tom felt it was unlikely it was that much of an issue. Tom felt the bigger issue was that DeVarti was jealous Tom was starting to have more success with his stores than DeVarti was having. Perhaps DeVarti was a little bitter he'd given the store away at a relatively cheap price. Whatever the real reason, DeVarti demanded Tom stop using the name Dominic's. Now, as we know, Tom had always had a bit of a temper, and when Tom heard this, he flipped out. Tom had an outburst where he accused DeVarti of being jealous and telling him his pizza sauce was terrible in comparison to his. Basically, it all got pretty ugly, and whereas they could have perhaps resolved things fairly amicably, Tom's outburst meant DeVarti got his lawyer to contact Tom and officially inform him he had to change names. The reason Tom was so reluctant to change names was because he'd been building Dominic's into a well-known brand in the area. Switching names at this point could definitely hurt his business, so Tom went to an advertising agency to seek advice. The obvious first choice was to simply rename it after Tom, perhaps use his surname and call it Monahan's Pizza, but it didn't really have the same ring to it. So the ad agency advised Tom to use something similar to Dominic's, since that's what everyone was used to. Plus, this was back in the days of people looking up places in a phone book. And so if Tom used a name that was very similar to Dominic's, people would still find his business if they looked up Dominic's in the phone book. So Tom tasked his employees with coming up with similar sounding names, and they went through at least 100 different versions, but none of them felt right. Until one day, one of Tom's delivery drivers burst through the door and said, "Tom, I've got the new name, Domino's." Something about it just clicked, and Tom excitedly shouted, "That's it, that's it." He danced around the store, and from that point on, they wouldn't be Dominic's, they'd be Domino's. This of course meant they also needed a new logo, and thus they picked a literal domino and chose bright colours that would stand out. Since Tom had 3 stores at the time, they put 3 dots on the domino, and Tom suggested every time they add a new store, they could add a new dot to the logo. The fact Tom thought that just shows even Tom himself had no idea how crazy things were about to get, and just how many stores he would soon be managing. Before we get to the next part of the Domino's story, let's talk about you. The fact you're watching Magnates Media probably means you're interested in business, and hearing all of these stories of entrepreneurs, you may be wanting to start a business of your own. But where do you even begin? Well, that's where today's video sponsor, Shopify, comes in. Shopify makes it easier than ever for entrepreneurs to start and grow their company. Shopify gives you all the tools to create a professional website, begin selling your product or service, receive payments, and accept orders from anywhere in the world. Now, a big part of Domino's success in recent years has come from their focus on selling online and via mobile. And this is something Shopify makes extremely easy. You can literally have a mobile-friendly site set up in minutes that's customized however you want. I love how straightforward Shopify makes everything, as no technical experience is required. And the great news is, if you use the link in the description below, you can get a free trial of Shopify to test it out yourself risk-free. Just click the link below now to see how Shopify can help make your idea a reality. Tom was now running the business himself, which was now called Domino's, and thanks to his work ethic, the improved sauce, and their locations near college campuses, the business was doing reasonably well. But of course, it was still a very small operation overall at this point, with just a couple of stores. However, one evening, half of Tom's staff didn't show up, and so Tom decided to limit the menu for the night to make it easier to deal with orders. Interestingly though, this led to a crucial discovery, as this turned out to be one of their most profitable nights so far. Tom realized that maybe having a simpler menu made sense even when they had their full staff back. The next day, Tom looked at the data and realized that over 80% of the orders from the dorms were for 12-inch pizzas. So Tom decided from now on that would be the only size they sold. For the people who wanted smaller pizzas, they'd probably just buy the 12-inch instead anyway and thus pay more. And for people who wanted more than a 12-inch pizza, they could just buy multiple pizzas. Offering one size instead of 5 would make it possible to provide better and faster pizzas, as well as saving money by only having one size delivery box. Tom did later end up adding a 16-inch pizza as well, but for a long time, Domino's just had those two sizes, small and large. Likewise, for a while, Tom only sold one drink, Coca-Cola, since it was the most popular choice. Tom also began offering just one type of crust. He cut the amount of topping choices to just 6, and he removed any non-pizza mains from the menu, like submarine sandwiches. So, from then on, Domino's offered a much simpler menu. And by removing the less profitable items, Domino's saw an immediate boost in profitability. Despite having less choice, people didn't order less food. They just ordered more of the more profitable items instead. And suddenly, Domino's got so much faster and more efficient at making food now that they had this simpler menu. And therefore, that night where Tom was forced to cut back the menu because of a staff shortage was actually a blessing in disguise. From that moment on, Tom would always remember that lesson of aiming for simplicity wherever possible. Domino's limited menu existed for decades with just a few offerings, allowing them to become great at those specific things rather than just average at a lot of different things. The simple menu also allowed them to deliver faster, which leads us to another unusual but very successful decision Tom made, focusing on free delivery. Tom distributed thousands of leaflets nearby, advertising fast free pizza delivery. Now, of course, some other places did delivery too, but back then nobody thought you could make much money on just delivery. Most places normally just offered it to get some initial customers before they could afford to cut out the delivery service. But Tom was convinced he could make delivery a key part of their business. And so Tom made the bold decision to not even provide sit-down dining in any of his stores, and instead became one of the first pizzerias to focus almost entirely on delivery. Whilst delivery obviously had costs, by removing sit-down dining like most restaurants had, Domino's could keep their stores much smaller and thus cheaper to run. It also meant they didn't need waiters either, like other pizza places had. And Tom correctly believed that because the delivery business was quite tough, it would be a barrier to entry for competitors. And he was right that delivery became their differentiator. Pizza Hut was known for its sit-down dining in its restaurants, Little Caesars dominated carryout orders, and Domino's focused on delivery, meaning the three chains all offered their own unique selling points. However, whilst Tom's focus on deliveries did bring in a lot of new orders, it also created a whole new set of problems, like the fact it was difficult to keep the pizza warm and crisp when delivering further away. So Tom started to think of a way to solve the problem. He asked several manufacturers to create a box made out of corrugated cardboard with holes in that would be more durable and insulated. He basically wanted a box that could retain heat for a longer period, but it also had to support the weight of other boxes on top of it without the lid sagging, as otherwise the pizza would stick to the top or bottom of the box. But Tom's new cardboard design could potentially solve that thanks to its thickness, as corrugated cardboard could absorb more oil than a single layer of paper and thus protect the layer of cheese from being squashed. At first though, manufacturers told him it wouldn't be possible to mass produce his design, to which Tom replied, "American technology is putting space satellites in orbit these days, and you're telling me you can't punch a clean hole in a piece of cardboard?" He insisted they find a way to make his idea work, and eventually they did. And it was a game changer. And thus Domino's is actually credited with the first use of corrugated cardboard for pizza boxes rather than the typical coated paper box that had been used for years. Tom had now created an ideal cheap pizza box that could be mass produced. And this encouraged Tom to keep innovating new ideas to try and improve other areas of the business. Like Domino's is also credited as being the first chain to use insulated delivery pouches to keep the food hot for longer. Tom also introduced revolving ovens to the store, which could accommodate more pizzas in less space than conventional ovens, and thus produce more pizzas faster. In other words, Domino's was becoming increasingly efficient. And with things now really picking up for Domino's, Tom started thinking about franchising. Even though at this point he had 3 stores and was doing fine financially, Tom didn't want to just get by. He wanted to build an empire. And he'd already started to see the success several other fast food chains had had with franchising. In fact, Pizza Hut had already franchised 145 stores by 1966. And so in 1967, Tom began looking for other entrepreneurs who wanted to open their own Domino's pizza store. And one of the main reasons Tom ended up having a lot of success with franchising is that he focused on placing stores near colleges and military bases, both places with lots of customers in a small area who were looking for a cheap, convenient meal. Very quickly, Tom got a good understanding of college student demographics and where the demand was, and soon Domino's was opening more and more stores near college campuses. He also learned it was better to be at the back of a campus where the dorms usually were, not the front where most of the retail shops were. Colleges were also extra appealing because it was pretty cheap to advertise there. When they opened a new store, Tom could run some cheap ads in the college newspapers rather than having to pay mainstream ad rates. However, whilst Tom thought he'd figured out a winning system, that was all about to come crashing down. With things seemingly going well and this new franchise model in place, Tom wanted to open a new store every week. And by 1969, he'd almost succeeded. Domino's opened 32 new stores. Unfortunately, it soon became clear most of them were failing, and quite quickly the company found itself in $1.5 million of debt from all these new unprofitable stores. Tom had seemingly overexpanded too quickly, and to avoid bankruptcy, Tom had to relinquish control to the bank, whose solution was to raise prices and cut costs by lowering quality. Unfortunately, this actually just made the situation worse and caused several franchisees to file lawsuits. The company was unable to pay its creditors for months. They started filing lawsuits against the company as well. The bank's attempts to steady things had failed horribly, and Tom took back control and decided to change their business model. From now on, instead of charging franchisees a big one-time fee to open a Domino's store, they changed it so there was no fee, but you had to successfully manage a Domino's store for a year first. This unconventional approach actually worked really well. It made sure franchise owners knew exactly what they were getting into first, and that they had both the experience and capital to make their store a success. Another major improvement was that Tom set up a big central location where all ingredients and supplies would be prepared and then delivered to all other Domino's stores. This firstly meant Tom could buy the raw ingredients in much larger volumes and thus get a discount, but it also meant that rather than each individual store having to buy and prepare their own ingredients on site, they were prepared at this central hub and then supplied to the different Domino's stores, thus ensuring everything was consistent and quality was maintained across all Domino's franchises. This system worked extremely well because it meant each Domino's pizza store could be much smaller, as they no longer needed a large storeroom to prepare all the ingredients on site. As a result, they could buy cheaper real estate for the stores, and they were also cheaper to run, since Tom had this central hub for preparing everything, and then all the stores had to do was assemble, bake, and deliver, which in turn made it easier for them to handle large amounts of orders. Tom's innovations like this cut costs and increased efficiency. And to be fair, even as the business grew, Tom continually did ongoing market research to try and improve efficiency even further. He would literally visit other pizzerias all over the country to analyze if there was anything he could learn from them, or better operational techniques he could apply. Ultimately though, after that brief scare where they'd taken on too much debt, Tom had now managed to clear the company's debts and sort things out with his creditors and franchise owners. The future was now looking bright again for both Tom and Domino's. They had a better system for vetting franchisees, their stores were more efficiently run, and they had a centralized prep system that guaranteed quality. By the end of 1969, Tom had 42 Domino's pizza stores spread across Michigan, Vermont, and Ohio. By 1978, Domino's had 200 outlets, and things were about to get a lot crazier. Delivery had long been Domino's main differentiating factor, but by the 80s, their rivals had now invested heavily in deliveries as well. Pizza Hut, backed by its massive parent company PepsiCo, converted thousands of its sit-down restaurants to delivery stores instead. This meant they were in very direct competition, and the pizza wars were well and truly on. But Tom had an idea to stand out from the competition, and in 1984, Domino's began guaranteeing pizza delivery within 30 minutes or else the pizza was free. This immediately boosted sales, as it was a win-win for customers. You either got fast delivery or free pizza. This big campaign helped Domino's ramp up their expansion even faster. In the 1980s, Domino's grew from 300 to 5,000 stores, and they became the fastest growing restaurant chain. Domino's also went global and opened their first store outside the US, firstly in Canada, but then many other countries all over the world. They also finally began to expand their menu further, offering more sides and non-pizza items like chicken wings, as well as an extra large 30-slice pizza called the Dominator. This success enabled Tom to fulfill another childhood dream of his. Well, sort of. Remember as a kid he'd wanted to play for the Detroit Tigers? Well, in 1983, he bought the team, and a year later, they won the World Series. And thus, things were looking great for both Tom and Domino's. The guarantee of delivery in 30 minutes or getting a free pizza continued to work great for a while. Sales increased, and Domino's gained a reputation for its fast delivery. But by 1989, things took a dark turn, and the campaign began to create a major problem for Domino's. It began when a 17-year-old delivery driver lost control of his pickup truck, skidded off the road, and died in a car crash. His townspaper ran the story, and some questioned if the reason for the crash was because delivery drivers had to get the pizza to customers in under 30 minutes, meaning some drivers were speeding in order to get there on time. And then some bigger papers picked up the story, and soon national magazines even ran it, claiming that Domino's Pizza had a deadly delivery problem. A report was soon released showing that more than 20 deaths had occurred involving Domino's drivers. Another story soon came out involving a collision with a Domino's delivery driver and a couple. The wife died and the husband was left with brain damage. The family's attorney blamed Domino's strict delivery time policies and the wage the driver was on, claiming the driver was forced to rush to get to his destination, which is what caused the tragic crash. The courts agreed, and Domino's ended up paying $32 million. Another high-profile lawsuit in 1993 involved a Domino's driver who ran a red light, hitting another driver and causing her spinal cord injuries. Domino's ended up paying $79 million in damages. Clearly, public outcry was mounting, and consumer groups even banded together to form People Against Dangerous Delivery, which was a group designed to lobby against Domino's practices. Domino's realized that what had once been extremely positive marketing for them was now turning into a very costly PR nightmare where people thought their drivers were speeding or unsafe because of the delivery guarantee. From that point on, Domino's decided to change their policy and instead offered a satisfaction guarantee instead of delivery in 30 minutes. Of course, for those who had already been injured or lost their lives, it seemed too little, too late. Right around the time Domino's dropped the 30 minutes or free guarantee, Domino's launched a new mascot named Noid, a strange troll-type creature with rabbit-like features. It's since been described as one of the most obnoxious mascots of all time, because rather than a typical lovable mascot, Noid was intended to be the opposite, a character designed to cause problems and be the villain. Here's how Fast Company described it. The Noid was a gibbering, pot-bellied, buck-toothed pervert squeezed into a skin-tight rabbit costume, a Hamburglar-like character wholly devoted to delaying pizza deliveries. Throughout the late 80s, Noid featured in a range of Domino's ads, where they told customers to avoid the Noid, and promised that their pizzas were Noid-proof. And yet, despite its crazy appearance, bizarrely, the Noid was a big hit with many consumers. It was just the right amount of weird and unique to catch on. And they even ended up making a line of toys, video games, and merchandise featuring the Noid. But then, quite suddenly, everything changed. On January 30th, 1989, an armed man named Kenneth Lamar Noid entered a Domino's restaurant in Georgia and held 2 Domino's employees hostage for over 5 hours. Kenneth Noid was mentally ill and believed that the Avoid the Noid campaign was personally directed towards him and designed to antagonize him. Kenneth Noid ranted about how Tom had stolen his name and he demanded payment. But then, whilst holding the Domino's employees hostage, he got hungry and ordered one of them to make him a pizza. Whilst he was eating it, the hostages thankfully escaped. Even though the employees weren't harmed, immediately after this, Domino's pulled Noid from its ads. The damage had been done. It was hard not to associate the Noid with this horrific event. Domino's denied that the incident was the reason they pulled Noid. But given that Noid was popular before this hostage situation, it seems fairly likely this was the reason. However, that wasn't the end for this strange mascot, as the Noid returned to Domino's TV ads in 2021. Hey guys, before we get to the next part of the story, I know a lot of you have been asking how I make these videos. So in the description under this video, I've put a link to the editing software I use and a link to where I get music and sound effects from. But if you really want to see step by step how these videos get made and the full behind the scenes process, I have been working on a course that will show everything from start to finish. It's not for sale yet, but if that's something you're interested in, you can join the waitlist using the other link in the description below, as I'll be sending out some invites fairly soon. So yeah, check out the link below, then let's get back to the story. With Domino's continuing to open new franchise locations all over the world, Tom was now a very wealthy man, and he decided to use some of that money to support charities that reflected his strong Catholic faith. The thing is, he did so under something called the Domino's Foundation, and this would end up causing a lot of controversy. It started when Tom donated $110,000 to the Committee to End State-Funded Abortions. He even pledged money live on TV to fight against state funding of abortions. Tom then also cancelled a fundraiser hosted by the National Organization for Women that was due to take place on land owned by Domino's, as he found out that the money would help pro-choice charities. In response to all this, the organization called for a nationwide boycott of Domino's in 1989. The boycotters claimed that Tom was basically funneling his pizza profits into limiting women's reproductive rights and promoting his own political aims. When a Domino's spokesperson was later asked about Tom, he admitted, "You couldn't keep him quiet. He was talking about abortion, and he was really pissing people off." The problem was that Tom was very publicly the leader and owner of Domino's, and so him very publicly taking strong political stances was always going to be divisive. But nearly a year after the boycott begun, Tom made the surprising announcement that he was planning to sell Domino's. At the time, he denied it was anything to do with the backlash he'd got, but many years later he admitted it was. He later said, "I felt a boycott like they had started could have an impact on a lot of people whose livelihood depended on Domino's. I didn't want to put our franchisees and employees in jeopardy because of positions I wanted to take. I didn't want to make a target out of the company." Tom also said his decision to sell was because he wanted more time to fully devote to his charitable efforts, and couldn't do that whilst also running a giant pizza chain. The sale did take much longer than Tom had planned though, largely because Domino's sales started to drop a bit and Tom decided he couldn't leave the company while it was in a downturn. But eventually, by 1998, when Domino's had thousands of stores, Tom sold the company to Bain Capital, Mitt Romney's private equity firm, for $1.1 billion. Not bad for a boy who'd been abandoned by his mother and started with practically nothing. However, for Domino's, whilst you'd think Tom stepping back as CEO would get rid of any controversy for the company, actually, there was plenty of new controversy still to come. It was Easter Sunday 2009, and two bored Domino's employees decided it would be funny to film themselves doing gross things to pizza ingredients that supposedly would then be given to customers. In a series of 5 videos called Disgusting Domino's People, the two Domino's employees violated pretty much all the health codes you can think of, like sneezing on a sandwich and other gross unsanitary stuff, and then uploaded the videos. As soon as Domino's found out, they contacted YouTube asking them to remove the video. But YouTube said they needed the copyright holder's permission, which was the two employees who'd made it. So Domino's raced to identify who the employees were. Since the employees were dumb enough to literally show their faces in the videos, it didn't take long to track them down. With the help of people on YouTube, within 3 hours Domino's figured out who'd made the video. And thankfully, Domino's were able to confirm that no orders were placed by customers during the time frame the videos had been made. It had just been a prank rather than actually serving the contaminated food to customers. Domino's fired the two employees and hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. By Tuesday, the video had reached 250,000 views. By Wednesday, it was at 1 million, and it would eventually rise to over 2 million views before getting removed. Twitter was talking about it, news sites picked it up, and if you type Domino's into Google search, 5 of the results on the first page referenced the gross video. It was a terrible look for Domino's, and they realized they had to address it. Thus, the Domino's president recorded a video apologizing to customers and assuring them the store had been completely sanitized and that going forward they'd be reviewing their hiring practices. But of course, far more people saw the original video than the Domino's explanation video. And to be fair to Domino's, there probably wasn't much else they could have really done. But that didn't change the fact that the image was in people's minds and reputational damage to the brand had been done. In fact, a national study conducted by HCD Research found 65% of respondents who would previously visit or order Domino's pizza were less likely to do so after viewing the video. And this wasn't the only time social media caused Domino's problems. Domino's also came under fire after a photo went viral of Domino's employees buying bags of extremely cheap potato wedges from a supermarket, which they then sold in stores with a ridiculously high markup, claiming to be their normal wedges. But to be honest, Domino's biggest problem wasn't social media. Domino's biggest problem was itself. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, Domino's stock price fell sharply, dropping below $3 per share. Now, of course, many companies went through a big slump in their share price at the time as the whole global economy suffered. But whereas most companies then began to bounce back, Domino's didn't. Many felt that after Tom had left the company, the quality of Domino's pizzas had fallen a lot. Reviews seemed to be getting worse and worse. Part of the problem was that the cost of Domino's ingredients had gone up significantly, over 40% in some cases. And so Domino's had tried to cut costs. Now, in small amounts, that wasn't too significant. Like they cheapened the sauce slightly or bought cheaper dough or cheese. But all of these little changes combined added up to a much worse product. And so, with a reputation for poor quality pizza, sales slowing down, costs increasing, and an ever-falling stock price, the situation for Domino's looked bleak heading into the 2010s. And yet, what if I told you that Domino's Pizza was one of the best performing stocks of the last decade? And I don't just mean in terms of food businesses, I mean literally in terms of all companies. Domino's was one of the best possible investments you could have made. In the last decade, Domino's stock price saw just under 4,000% growth. So, how did they do this? Well, after two of the company's worst years, Patrick Doyle became CEO, and he immediately conducted market research to find out how customers really felt about Domino's. And the feedback was brutal. Focus groups strongly criticized their pizza for lacking flavor, and some said the crust tasted like cardboard. But this brutal feedback forced Domino's to honestly reevaluate their product, and they took the decision to essentially start over. They would reformulate their entire pizza recipe, developing a new pizza with a new taste, texture, and appearance. They rebuilt their supply chain, introduced new ingredients, and made a lot of fundamental changes, basically creating a new original pizza from the crust up. Everything from the dough to the cheese to the sauce was redone and new varieties added. But the real stroke of genius was that Domino's then ran a massive ad campaign where they took full responsibility for the recent poor quality and apologized to customers. They basically admitted that they knew their product's quality kinda sucked now. They even showed actual footage from focus groups where people had said the crust was like cardboard. But then Domino's announced they'd completely overhauled their pizzas and were making massive changes. They even documented their process of the head chefs making improvements to the recipe. At the end of the ad campaign, the head chefs personally delivered the new pizzas to some of Domino's critics, and they admitted this new version of the pizza was much better. This relaunch was a risky gamble for such a well-established chain. They were changing everything about their product and publicly admitting the old product wasn't that good. And they had no real backup plan. But this bold move absolutely worked. People respected the honesty, and it convinced them to give the new recipe a try, which was indeed better. By confronting the criticism head-on and being transparent, Domino's began to win customers back over. The campaign got over 1 billion media impressions, and Domino's sales increased rapidly. So did Domino's stock price, far outpacing the S&P 500 and many big tech companies. From trading below $3 in 2008, Domino's share price later crossed over $400 a share. Patrick also streamlined convenience and speed. Like, instead of making dough at each location, he set up several dough factories across the US, which would supply ready-made dough to the stores. But by far one of the most crucial reasons for Domino's turnaround and huge success in the past decade is technology. In fact, as weird as this might sound, Patrick has said Domino's is a tech company that just happens to sell pizza. What he meant by that is that for a long while, Domino's have tried to focus on being innovators. For example, they were the first pizza chain to launch mobile ordering back in 2007, and they actually experimented with a website all the way back in 1996. They've consistently tried to make it easier for customers to order, and the vast majority of their sales do now come online. They also found that when customers have the full menu in front of them online, people ordered more food than they did in store anyway. Now, obviously other companies caught up quickly with apps and websites, but Domino's was definitely one of the pioneers in online ordering, and have continued to invest in tech that makes things more efficient for both customers and employees. For example, Domino's launched the pizza tracker so people could track their order right from the moment of purchase all the way through to being delivered to their door. And they've even experimented with self-driving cars and pizzas delivered by drones. There's no doubt their investments in tech have paid off massively. However, despite being founded in 1960, it took until 2019 that Domino's finally claimed the #1 spot in the pizza wars, when they eventually surpassed Pizza Hut's sales numbers. After 60 years in business, Domino's had become the largest pizza operation in the world. But of all the pizza chains, I think the story of Papa John's is probably even crazier. So go check that out next by clicking this video right here. Thank you for watching Magnates Media, and I'll see you in the next video in just a second.